Welcome to A Coleman Conversation. I'm talking about Kyle Gustafson, National Client Manager, Partner Science and Engineering Incorporated. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us. I've known Kyle for a number of years. What do you do?
Well, thanks for having me on, Bob. I really appreciate it. So what we help with is due diligence, for commercial real estate transactions. Specifically in SBA, we do phase one analysis. Phase two, we also help with remediation. My specialty is construction, so I really want to help, small businesses get
All right,
into
I'm gonna stop you there. I'm sorry. I'm gonna stop you. No one
Sure.
knows what. Assume.
Yeah.
Let's dumb this down.
Okay.
I'm an entrepreneur. I want to buy a C store, or I want to buy a manufacturing facility for my manufacturing company because of the Made in America. And I'm looking at this property, and I got a old gasoline tank in the back of my warehouse. Tell me what you do.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's a great way to put it into the audience's perspective. So one, being an entrepreneur is tough, and there are some risks here associated with a property like this. So what we want to do is look into the history of that property. If there is a submerged tank, has it been remediated? Has it been taken out? What's the history? What's been filed, with the state, with the Environmental Protection Agency? And so we want to go back and do a little due diligence around that to make sure it's not a risk, because a bank doesn't want an asset like that on their books.
And why? Tell me why. Tell me, dumb it down again. Tell me why that's a problem for the lender.
Well, yeah, and so, with some cavalier borrowers, they might say, like, who cares?
It's a tank.
Oh, it's an old tank.
Yeah, I got a backhoe. Put dirt in it.
We'll just fill it in. No worries. Right. It was never there. And so really what's the danger of that is, one, you have a dirty property. And what that means is the earth, the water, and the air could be toxic. And then just dumb it down to the lowest level.
Right.
And so you might be operating that C-store and your staff might get really sick, or you might get really sick. And so that is a long-term health risk for you, but also the contamination can spread. If the water table shifts in that area, that contamination can move down the street. Recently, I had a hotel that had a Superfund flowing underneath it from a dry cleaner that dumped its perk into the aquifer below the building. They didn't dump it into the aquifer; it just seeped down into the ground. For that.
Tell me what the liability is for the borrower in that situation, as well as the lender.
Gotcha. Yeah. So the liability there is the cleanup.
Right.
And so we saw this in 2008 through 12, where a lot of properties came back to banks and they were dirty. Or basically in the bank's care, things spilled or tanks exploded, and banks didn't know how to maintain those properties. So, digging into the environmental risk is really important to make sure that you minimize that potential loss to the bank because of a big contamination or a big spill. And it's another thing, banks just don't want these types of properties on their books without those things being remediated. So they can be cleaned. It just is a matter of how much.
Right? Yeah, it's a problem and also for the borrower and the bank. It clouds the title. You're responsible for the cleanup.
Exactly.
If you're an SBA lender, then the guarantee may be in jeopardy because the SBA is going to say, "Well, now tell me what a phase one and phase two are."
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So a phase one, what we want to go out and just assess the property. It's a site visit. We look for any types of like you mentioned. Abandoned tanks, tanks in the ground, materials on site that could be dangerous or be leaking. And then we do some analysis, hit some databases to check and see what's been filed, what hasn't, and then try to put together a risk assessment for the property. And then if we do find something, or there are some of those signs that there might be contamination present, then we would order a phase two. And so a phase two is really where you start getting into borings. Then we're going to go out onto that property and dig into the ground and see what's there. And so that's one of the areas that makes it a little bit more expensive, just because there is equipment that has to go on site. And unfortunately, the more boring, the more expensive it is. But you want to get a sample that's reflective of the property. And so in SBA, well, there's always this pricing pressure, especially around
Sure.
C stores, like you mentioned in your example. And what I would advise any BDOs out there that are working in this space, and one of these comes up, and there might be a submerged tank, is just mention to your borrower that, hey, due diligence around environmental is going to be more expensive on this loan right from the very get-go. So that way they know. But then we also have a lot of pressure. They always want to get the pricing down on these phase twos. And really, you have to be careful because you need to get a good sample set from that property and get it from, where people might be working, outside, near the tank, maybe across the lot, things like that. So, yes, you can sometimes bring that price down, but you might actually increase your risk. So it's always good to have an environmental consultant you can trust who can say, hey, this is the best we can do.
And when you're talking environmental consultant, you do other type of services, such as it could be a national historic designation, or back east, not so much California. It could be a cemetery type of situation. Expand on that.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, one of the things that we do a lot of work in is construction, as well as renovations. And so sometimes those are historic buildings. And so I have a couple right now that are like, revamping old theaters, which is kind of neat, for some really interesting cities, some on the West Coast even. But one area that you do need to be very careful of is a lot of times borrowers go into these properties somewhat blind. And
Right.
Think of it like when you buy a house, you do a home inspection. I would recommend doing a property condition assessment for those historical properties, or really any properties you're going to do a PIP, a property improvement plan, or renovate that property, and just find out what the real capital spend for that property is forecasted for the next 8 years. And so if you get a good PCA, you'll know what the roof material is made of, how long it will last, the useful life of all the equipment. And then as you get into the renovation, then you can bring in that historical aspect and say, okay, the facade of this building is this specific type of rock or marble or concrete or whatever it is. And unfortunately, with those historical properties, you have to keep them, in line with the historic look. And so
it can be done, but it's very expensive, and challenging. You're an expert in construction. You did a great webinar for us a while back on construction. Tell me about, so shifting gears a little bit, the environmental is so important that the borrowers and lenders need to know what they're getting into. But construction is fraught with terror as well. Construction lending was explained to me a long time ago. A construction loan is an unsecured loan to the lender. The borrower has no asset until you get that certificate of occupancy. Tell me what you do to mitigate the risk for both the borrower and the lender in the construction process.
Yeah, and Bob, I think it's important too to kind of put it in perspective. Like the nice thing about SBA is that this isn't a bridge loan. This is a loan for the long term.
Yes.
And so you're really gonna be with this borrower potentially for 25 years if they never refi on a 7A or a 504. And so typically that construction period can be very challenging. And so what you find in SBA, because the lending caps are a little bit low these days, and so I would argue we need to push those up. So when people say, hey, we want to push this up to 10 million, I'm all for that, especially around construction, just because projects are more expensive now.
Well, I don't mean to just interject. That $5 million cap's ridiculous. That was set in 2010. And adjusting for inflation, that's now we're at 7.4 million. So
exactly.
Go ahead.
And that's the way I look at it too. Is in this space, there's some limitations just because you're dealing with contractors that are less sophisticated. You're also dealing with borrowers that are less sophisticated or maybe not as experienced. And so this might be their turn to actually own a piece of real estate for themselves. They may have been leasing all this time, and now they're finally at the cash flow where it makes sense. Oh my gosh, I can build my dream property, or I can take what the market allows me to have and rehab it into what I need it to be. And so that's kind of the exciting part, is that, we're growing communities, we're growing buildings. These are things that have never existed before or have and need to be repurposed. And so that's the fun part.
Yeah, that's a great description. If I'm a lender and I'm a borrower and I want to construct a hospitality unit on I-80 outside of Omaha, Nebraska,
Sure.
and it's going to take me 9 months to pull a permit to start. How much should I budget an increase to start in spring of 2026 for my construction project? And I know it's geographical.
Oh man,
yeah. So
you're asking me.
Go ahead. I'll let you answer it. I know.
That far a projection, anything could happen. But I would say with tariffs, the steel tariffs are supposed to hit yesterday, and aluminum tariffs, and a hotel like that would definitely use that in the structure. Now, let's say you're the underwriter, Bob.
Right.
What I would advise you to do is look at that budget and then highlight the specific line items that might be affected by those tariffs. And there's some great resources out there to track these things, and I can give them to you so you can put them in the comments if you'd like to. But basically, if you look at that line item, about half of that is labor, the other half is materials.
Thank you.
So let's say you have $400,000 in steel, so 200,000 of that is actual material. You'd probably want to, if it's a 50% tariff, you'd probably want to run the numbers in a spreadsheet and just see what that equates to, and then maybe put that into a little additional contingency into the project, and just make sure that you're covering your borrower just in case they run into an issue, because it's always harder to make these loans larger. What
I hear you saying is there's risk out there, but we can manage it, we can mitigate it, and don't shy away from these projects.
No, yeah. I heard a lender the other day say, we're just going to charge 25% contingency on all of our construction loans across the board. And I just felt that was too broad brush. It's like, well, not every construction project is going to get hit by these tariffs.
And you made a great point. I'm interrupting, but you made a great point on this steel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not on the total $400,000 contract. It's only on the metal itself, the product itself. Yeah,
exactly. Now again, steel is in a lot of things, so that's the other part. Appliances. I would, as the underwriter too, I would look at that budget and say, okay, are they trying to get ahead of these tariffs? Do they order these things early? Do they need deposits? Is the bank willing to help with deposits in an environment like this, where maybe we could beat a tariff and save a ton of money for our client? I would hope so. The other side too is you would want to look for storage, because they're going to have to store that somewhere, and make sure that you allow for storage of offsite material. Make sure that it's insured and that you have a copy of that insurance policy as well. Builder's risk.
I love it. I always like to ask, how did you get into this space? What was your undergraduate degree in?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So my undergrad was in economics. Then I did a master's in basically international affairs, international economics.
What school? What schools?
And so my focus was U.S.-Chinese trade.
Okay.
I thought I'd be doing that. And then, I moved out to Colorado. And I'd done construction through college, and when I was on a site.
When you say construction, you're talking the hard hat and the belt, and you're on the site. What are you doing?
Yeah, so the first experience I ever had with a job like this, I was on a site. It's Florida, middle of the summer. I'm pouring sweat. I'm carrying, I think, those huge black slate like countertops into a lab over in this medical building we're helping build. And the elevator wasn't working. We had to take it up the stairs. It was horrible, just pouring sweat. And so we go to grab one out of the truck, and this Cadillac pulls up, and this guy gets out in this nice suit, puts his coat on, walks by. I'm like, who's that? And the guys are like, oh, that's the banker.
I already know where this is going.
And then one of the guys is like, he doesn't know shit. And I'm like, well, I think he does. That's a great job. And so I was like, oh, that all right. I'm gonna keep that file in the memory banks as I'm like hauling these giant countertops up these stairs. And then years later, I was out in Colorado. I'd moved there, didn't know a soul, and I was interviewing, and a lady I still hold in high rapport and still close with today. Penny Roach, she took a gamble on me and said, "Hey, I think you could do this job." And so she started me as a client manager, and the rest was history. So, yep.
I love it. Talk about motivation. I go, I want that job. I want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There's some other things I did along the way. I was an SBA lender for Union Bank for a little while, so it's always nice to be on the vendor side and then understand, how challenging it is to put some of these deals together, at a bank and, follow, underwriting guidelines and SBA guidelines and then keep the borrower happy. That's a tremendous challenge. And I have a lot of empathy for all the BDOs that I work with. Some of them are just amazing people. They do a great job for these small business owners. And they're really trying to help them along the way. And that's the exciting part, is being part of that.
You mentioned the BDO. What is the one piece of advice that you would give a SBA business development officer to make the transaction go smoother?
Smooth is to me is expectations being set properly.
Excellent.
And then
Excellent
also
answer.
understanding your bank's credit box. To me, that's the most important thing, because you don't want to waste anybody's time, and then just listening to the client's needs, and then being creative with structuring that deal. If they need seasonality in it, take the time to do the math and really build the product for them. Because if you give it to them in the right way, just like a doctor prescribing the right medicine, you can make them a very healthy business. However, if you do this in a sloppy fashion, it can be an ill-fitting suit, and they'll be really happy to get out of an SBA loan when they can. So,
what piece of advice would you give the credit risk manager, the person in charge of making sure that the SBA loan portfolio those guarantees are valid? What are you going to tell them about, gang, you really need to do this on your construction loans?
Yeah.
To keep that SBA guarantee valid.
Yeah, there's a few things, and so I would say first it starts at the very beginning. And so, really taking the time to train your closers and construction funders on what a complete package is, and then teaching them how to kind of go through the documents and make sure that the budget, the contract, the address, like all the due diligence information matches, just to start. And again, these folks are putting these deals together, also putting them into E-Tran, doing all the different things that they have to do for SBA to make these things work, and working with the borrower. So it's a very challenging job that takes a lot of communication. But start early, be organized, and then as you're working with a third party like me, ask us questions. If something doesn't make sense, don't be afraid to raise your hand and say, "Hey, what does this mean?" Or what I don't understand why you want a different plan set. Why is that? Oh, well, these aren't stamped. We need them stamped, type of thing from the county or municipality. And then, making sure that your guarantee is intact, document, right? Like that's the name of the game. Is if things do, become risky, or there is something that you uncover during construction or something comes up, just document your file, work through it with the borrower. And, really the goal of this is to get this project, done on time, free of liens, and hopefully within budget, right? Those are that's the happy project. If we can get it through all those things, and then we have a performing business at the other end, we did it right. And so, to me, I'm really excited when we get the last draw and reach substantial completion. And it's like, all right, we got another one going. Off you go.
Well, good for you. I've enjoyed the conversation. Of construction lending is perfect for SBA financing. It is fraught with issues, but if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Exactly.
But I like your answer. Just and you said a lot. It was a throwaway line, but when you said check the address, I mean, I read so many reports, and the number one issue that the SBA has on collateral is we're not in the right lien position. We just didn't do something as simple as that. This is not complicated. Today, the feds, the FDIC lifted the ban on Wells Fargo and is going to allow them to grow their assets. And the president said, hey, this isn't, we're not in the back creating stuff with measuring drops. We know what we have to do, and it's simply execution. So I love what you're saying. Kyle Gustafson, National Client Manager, Partner Engineering. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us in A Coleman Conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it.